Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and welcome to the opening keynote of the Teaching and Learning with AI mini conference. Today is Thursday, June 27th, 2024. Reed Hepler is our conference chair. And Reed, I'm going to turn the time over to you at this point.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Hello, welcome everybody to the opening keynote of Teaching, Learning, and Learning with AI Summit. This is should be really exciting and really an explorative panel. We have a bunch of amazing people who have agreed to speak with us and to share their thoughts. So first, I'm going to give a brief intro, which was also the intro to the summit on the website. And then we're going to go into the questions. We're going to ask questions, and then panelists, when you answer first, then you can introduce yourself with whatever you want to say about yourself. But first, what effects do generative artificial intelligence technologies, tools, and applications have on learning and teaching? What impacts will they have on our educational abilities and activities, collaboration and communication, literacy, student agency, and independent, informal, and lifelong learning? This panel will consider these questions and more. While AI technologies have many drastic potential benefits, there are also challenges and concerns expressed by professionals, students, and educators about the impact of these new technologies on teaching and learning and the information ecosystem as a whole. Some are reasonably concerned about protecting privacy and confidentiality of students while using generative AI tools and ensuring equity and accessibility. Others worry about ethics, plagiarism, bias, misinformation, transparency, and the loss of critical thinking. And all in the learning professions are wondering how AI might allow or require changes in pedagogy and curricula. So we have many issues and many questions to ask. We have Dr. Lara Dumin, Jason Gulya, Dr. David Wiley, and Dr. Tazin Daniels here with us. So thank you all for participating. And Dr. Daniels, we'll start with you on this question. If you want, what principle or guidelines do you consistently consider when you use generative AI?
Oh, that's great. Thanks so much, Reed, and for Steve putting together this conference, and for everyone in the audience here too. I know when it comes to principles or guidelines, I've been on countless committees where that's been the first charge, right? What are the principles and guidelines that we're going to put together, as though there are some like omniscient rules that if we adhere to these rules, then we will avoid all mistakes with AI. And what I have found is that guidelines really should be signposts to help us make decisions, right? They're not pathways to make all decisions, but it's something to help us align with our overarching goal. And so for me, I would say the number one question I always ask when there's a decision in front of me around Gen AI and teaching is, will using this tool enhance learning or will it undermine learning? And in what ways? And so I think that that is the number one thing that we should be thinking about. It's not necessarily going to be a clear answer. And in fact, I would say that it's something that requires a lot of conversation, experimentation with students to figure out what are the ways that we can use it as a tool and not as a crutch. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, that's an awesome answer. Fantastic. Jason, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so my main question is the same. Thinking about whether it's enhancing learning or not. And the other question I constantly ask myself is if I'm doing everything I can to think about that technology from the student side. I think that one of the pitfalls that we run into when we want to incorporate AI into a lesson or into a course or into a learning experience, whatever it is that we tend to, and I totally understand why, we think about it as teachers, as instructors. But I think that the more we can do to think about it as a student, when they encounter this technology or being asked to use technology in a certain way, what are they thinking about it? And if I'm not sure what they're thinking about it, am I giving them avenues for talking to me about it and actually letting me know what they're thinking, how they're processing? So really, for me, it's an exercise in empathy. So if we feel pretty confident that working AI into that thing, whatever it is, enhances student learning, then am I being empathetic? Am I giving my students the chance to share their own ideas? And am I trying to think of it from their perspective? So that's my second question that I will add to the mix.
Awesome, fantastic. A lot about ideation and kind of, having the human be the critical thinker, and then using it as a tool. This is really good. Dr. Dumin, what are your ideas? And you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. I was having trouble with the audio there for a second. Jason and I have had a number of conversations on LinkedIn about AI and some of these guiding principles. One of the things that I agree with him here is, are we looking at it from the student point of view? And also, as Dr. Daniel said, do we need it, right? Like, what's the purpose of bringing it in? I also think about the environmental concerns. So, you've got people who are using AI for every little thing. What should I do this afternoon? What should I wear today? And then when they learn how much water and energy that takes, they go, oh, maybe I don't want to be doing that. So I like to talk to people, faculty and students about that. And I also like to talk with my students and with other faculty about the biases that are inherent in the output and how we really need to be careful about those biases. And we need to know enough about a topic to know if AI has gone off the rails. And I think that sometimes people forget that, even for me, I'll be going, oh, that sounds really great. Claude gave me a really good answer. I like this. But then I had something the other day where it said, John Smith said this and Brian Randall said this, whatever. And I had to make sure that I went out and checked every single one of those to make sure that they were real. Whoa.
Okay.
Chat just went bad there. So as we think about, these principles and guidelines, we want to make sure that we're helping our students and other people as well to understand some of those concerns. And Reed, I'll just let you take care of that, or Steve.
Steve, if you would take care of that, thank you. Okay, so we'll just continue on. What aspect of AI do you think is the most misunderstood by educators and by students, especially in terms of use cases? Dr. Wiley, do you want to take the lead on that?
Sure, thanks. And it's kind of painful to have a little reminder here that no educational technology is without its problematic aspects here. For on the educator side, what aspect do I think is most misunderstood by educators? I think that one's actually pretty easy. It's that a lot of educators believe that AI writing can be reliably detected. It absolutely cannot be reliably detected. The only thing that AI detection tools reliably do is penalize students who are English as a second language speakers. And so using those tools, when educators use those tools, whether they realize it or not, what they're doing is kind of instantiating one of the possible harms of using these tools to our most vulnerable students. So, so if there's one idea I could disabuse educators of, it would be that they can use AI to detect AI, because can't reliably do that. On the student side, I think I would echo back something that we've already heard, which is that you can really only use generative AI effectively if you understand what you're trying to do. So something I try to help my students understand is that at its core, what generative AI does is essentially follow instructions. So if you're not capable of writing instructions that are clear and thorough and accurate and detailed, you're not going to get good output out of generative AI. And if you don't know if you don't already know beforehand what the output should look like, you're not capable of evaluating the outputs of generative AI. So generative AI can amplify the things that we're already able to do. But if you can't write clearly and thoroughly and accurately in a detailed way, you're going to have a real problem using generative AI effectively. And I'll just say as an aside that really effective assessments and assignments are written in a way that they're clear, thorough, accurate, and detailed, which is why it's so easy to just put them into generative AI and have it create a reasonable response for them.
Okay, thank you. What practices, and this is something we can use more generally as well. What practices can educators use to ensure that AI use in their classrooms is ethical and inclusive? And of course, you can, these are practices. I think a lot of the data practices and the inclusivity practices are really general practices that you can apply to any technology, really. So in general, talking about just ethical and inclusive technology use, what practices do you recommend? Jason, do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, sure. And so one of the ways that I approach this in the classroom is really leaning to AI literacy. And a lot of this is very much related to what Laura talked about in terms of being aware of all the issues, all the biases, thinking about ethics, really from the very beginning. I think that the tendency, especially early on with this technology, was to kind of backload ethics, that we show students how to use this technology, if they are using this technology, and then we kind of talk about, oh, these are the ethical concerns. One of the things that I truly believe is that ethics should be front-loaded. I think that we should work it into our conversations from the very beginning. And I often start off with my students talking to me about it. Right? If I show them this technology, I let them talk to me about some of the ethical concerns. And some of them know a lot about it. I'm actually surprised by how much they know about the environmental concerns, the ethical concerns, or thinking about things that we can help ensure that the AI is being used responsibly and ethically, right? As much as we possibly can. And my students have great ideas for creating a safe space. So I let them take the lead in terms of helping me understand what can be done.
Okay. I think every one of you have talked about kind of letting the students have their ideas and letting them kind of learn for themselves how to use these tools. Can you speak, and I'll talk to ask Dr. Daniels this, can you speak as to how you let students take the lead on that or use those tools? Is that something built into the assignments, or do you have more discussions about that? What do you do as far as that?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking. I can give you two examples. So just like everyone else has said, for us, it might feel normal to start a conversation with like, what do you think the guidelines should be around any kind of teaching methodology? But that is still not the standard practice in academia. Most instructors still don't use facilitation guidelines, let alone having a conversation around Gen AI. So I think as an educational developer, part of what I try to do is like normalize and empower instructors to have that conversation. A lot of times as instructors, we can feel like we need to have all the answers, but in fact, there is no way. We're still riding this tidal wave of Gen AI, and who knows what direction it will take us. So at our teaching center, we've developed like a set of discussion questions to have at the very beginning, some that are more generalized and other ones that are discipline specific, because a lot of these students are going to go into a workforce where Gen AI is going to be ubiquitous. And so they need to be thinking about the disciplinary specific implications as well, and asking those bigger questions around academic honesty and what does it mean to be a responsible, producer in academia. So I think, yeah, having like day one class discussions, talking about the policies, seeing if there are any questions or lack of clarity around the policy is one way to do it. Another activity that I've been thinking about is around this question Dr. Dumin brought up around like bias. And I was sitting in a group of other educational developers, and we were talking about this thing of bias as though it is this evil that we must eliminate from everything. And I was thinking to myself, like, is that possible? Can we eliminate bias? And how is bias in AI any more dangerous or any different than just run-of-the-mill human bias? And the answer is that most people realize that humans have bias, right? But for some reason, I mean, lots of important reasons, we assume that Gen AI is like the all-knowing, objective truth. And I think that's something that as students, right, like we need to teach them how to detect and dispel that. So can we create an exercise around this where we're actually using the production of generative AI content and outputs as an exercise in detecting and understanding and assessing the impacts of bias? And then from there, developing skill sets around how do you produce prompts? How do you write prompts that minimize biased responses, right? How do you have a conversation to kind of like pull out, tease out, and not remove, but like to consider the bias in your final production? And then finally, how do you assess the response and the output, right? To determine whether or not this is actually representing the viewpoints that you hold as, right, the collaborator with the AI. So, so these are these bigger educational concepts, right, that we can now use Gen AI as a tool to help us explore and tease out. And we don't have to write the assignments ourselves because Gen AI can help us do that. We just need to know what the limitations are. So 2 examples there.
Okay, well, that speaks a lot what you just said to like the idea of like a critical thinking and information literacy. Like you need to be thinking things through before we even use the tool. Like I really like Dr. Jen Beatrix-Law's a rhetorical prompt framework and the CoStar framework and a lot of different things, but a lot of them, they're not really for the AI tool. It's so the user can think through things. And when you think through, what is the objective? What do I want to have completed? What do I want to create? You also think, how can I create that ethically? How can I create that without bias? Exactly. How can I control or like influence my prompt so it minimizes the bias that's going to be present and critically analyze that? So yeah, that is fantastic. Does anybody else have anything to kind of respond to what Dr. Daniel said? That was a really good idea.
Reed, I might just chime in with the thought that, and it's gone through the chat a couple of times, and that I totally agree with this idea that, and when we've said it here in the panel as well, that these principles that we're talking about at a high level, they're not unique to generative AI. And it's so weird that we keep talking about them as if they were. When I talk to my students about the risks of generative AI, part of that conversation is, look, no professor is infallible. No tutor in the tutoring center is infallible. Nobody in your Wednesday night study group is infallible. The algebra influencer you're watching on TikTok is not infallible. And that's the thing, by the way. And the generative AI is not infallible either. You have to be thinking critically and in a very careful way about all the information you're getting from everybody. There's no source that you can go to that's going to give it to you 100% correct all the time. And generative AI fits into that category. And there are techniques for how we deal with that in other areas, and those same principles can apply here. It's not like it's a completely novel problem that we don't have long-standing approaches for.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'd like to say that AI literacy is 45% technology literacy and 55% information literacy, which means it's skills that you should have known all the time. You're just combining them together. And I'm teaching an info lit class actually right now, and that's a lot of the time. I'm like, you should be using these general tools that I'm teaching with AI or with anything. In fact, I'm teaching them information literacy in general, and then I'm saying use those principles in connection with AI because it's the same principles just applied in a different way. That's really, really awesome. Thank you, David, for that. Again, I'm blown away by all these things. We have a few people who are asking, really probably a lot of people who are asking us to discuss the environmental impacts of generative AI and how we address those in education and encourage our students to be mindful of that. And Dr. Dumin, you talked about that briefly. Do you want to expand on that idea? I believe it was you.
Yeah.
Okay.
There was a piece on, I think it was on Marketplace about 3 weeks ago. I posted in the Facebook group for anybody who's in the Facebook group that I run about the environmental impact. And I know Whitney Gegg Harrison has a really good unit on that as well. And so one of the things that I'm going to start doing is we're going to start reading some of these things in class and talking about them and discussing how we feel about them. For example, if I'm not willing to use plastic diapers, I want to use cloth diapers, or if I'm not going to use paper towels, I'm going to use, like SCOI cloths or pre-fold diapers or whatever instead. Those are environmental things that I'm already doing. And so I know that there are things that students are already doing or they're thinking about or they've been exposed to. So we can talk about it in those ways as well. But I think just the more that we bring that out and we talk to people about it, I've met so many people who don't even know that there are any environmental costs. They don't realize that it's worse than Bitcoin mining kind of stuff, cryptocurrency mining. It's really bad. So I think the more that we can bring that to students and help them to see it, just expose them to the ideas, the more likely they are to take something away from it. And hopefully maybe that will impact their use in the down direction.
I know I just chimed in a minute ago, but just to follow up on what Laura just said, I think lots of us have heard the saying that the generative AI we're using now is the stupidest generative AI that will ever use. I think it's also true that the generative AI we're using right now is the dirtiest, most environmentally harmful generative AI that we'll ever use. I think of it like the Industrial Revolution and those original factories and how pollutive they were. And over time, people got smarter about controlling pollution and getting some of those environmental impacts at least under better control than they were like in London 100 years ago. But there's good progress being made already on hardware, that consumes less power to do the same amount of inference. Algorithms are improving to be more efficient in how they provide inference. So I don't think the environmental impact issues are very real, but I think we can anticipate them getting better over time as there's more focus on specialized hardware, more efficient algorithms and things like that. So I think that's an interesting space for us to watch and to encourage people to be working on.
We had another. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Reid. I was going to add just my two slightly informed cents about it, which is just to build on Laura's point. Yes, students are individual users of this, but they're also the future, right? These are also people who are in engineering programs and also have consumer power. And so they're the kinds of folks who will, as they enter into the workforce, can have put some pressure on some of the policies and practices around these large scale, like technological uses. And also I think it goes back to talking about how this reflects our values of society, which is why when we talk about the use of generative AI, we have to bring all the disciplines to the table. It's not just about the software engineers, but it's about the social scientists and the ecologists. And what better place to come up with solutions to that than a university setting where you have access to all that knowledge. So I think it's a scary conversation because there's no clear right answer, but who's going to come up with those answers if not our students now and in the future?
Thank you. For that, I apologize. I'm a little, obviously, still recovering, and someone has, yes. I would like to acknowledge that occurred. Someone came in and used very offensive language, and we promptly kicked them out. But I deeply apologize, and I am personally offended at that. That is one of the reasons that we do not allow or ask not to have this link publicly shared, because then things like that can happen. And I assure you that I personally will be working more to prevent that happening in the future. We have taken steps to do that, to prevent that. But again, just to acknowledge and apologize for that. That was obviously completely uncalled for. Related to that a little bit, what potential harms, and we've talked about environmental harms, we've talked about bias, ethics, and we can expand upon those. Before we talk about specific use cases in teaching and learning, what potential harms do you inform students of? And do you kind of have when you talk about AI literacy, do you focus on the harms, or do you focus on the uses and the benefits? And then you say, by the way, these are things you need to consider before you use AI tools. How do you approach those harms and those issues that you need to think about? Jason, do you want to start? Yes. Oh, Laura. Yeah, Laura can start.
Yeah. So those of you who know me know that I am neurodiverse. And when we talk about some of the harms that can actually be mitigated, when we think about some of the anxiety, some of the struggles for getting over not being able to complete assignments, that is a space where I think AI can be really helpful to mitigate some of the harms. But as David pointed out, every time we use AI detectors, we are entrenching, harming people who have been historically marginalized. So people from all sorts of backgrounds who have been historically marginalized. And we have to be so careful about how we are using that technology to make sure that we are helping people and not hurting them. And I think that's one of the spaces that really matters a lot to me, because as we see students who are struggling to try and graduate, or, first gen students, or students who just don't have those support networks, the AI can be really helpful to them as long as we show them how to use it well. And it's been amazing for me to see. We work with a lot of first gen and non-traditional students who are parents or who are coming back, or sandwich generation. And it's just amazing to watch how much they can do once they know what tools are in place for them. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Okay. Jason, do you want to go ahead and continue that?
Yeah, and Laura, thank you so much for that response. I think that that's so powerful. And I think that in my conversation with students, the good and the bad sides of this technology kind of naturally come up at the same time. So, for example, when I talk to my students about this technology and voice, and I'll have an open discussion with them, and my students will almost automatically bring up these two ideas that, one, used in a certain way, AI can give voice to students, right? It can give them ways to get through writer's block. So many of my students are terrified of looking at that blank page, right? Coming from a writing perspective. And so this gives them the way to lean into their own voice. But then once we hover it over a little bit, my students bring up, well, they're actually worried about losing their voice a little bit, that they have this program they can use. And so there's actually this anxiety built into that. So some of my students say that I'm still trying to come into my own voice, so I'm worried I'm going to overly rely on this technology. And I think that in many ways is emblematic of how a lot of the discussions with my students go when we think about AI and the implications of it, whether they're personal implications or social implications, that my students have a very strong sense of the good and the bad is very much intertwined. And that kind of goes across the board, that especially for a student, the immediate dangers, right? They're worried, my students are worried about losing their voice. They're worried about becoming overly reliant on this tool, right? That suddenly maybe down the line they have to pay for, or it becomes more and more expensive, or they don't have access to for some reason. And so all these worries start to come out. And so for me, I try as much as possible to balance pretty consistently the good and the bad and the uses and the misuses, especially because that's where my students are, that's how they're approaching this technology.
To go off of what Jason was talking about, kind of guarding against people becoming overly reliant on these tools, and kind of to go back to what I guess kind of the purpose of the whole summit, what assignments or what workflows or what guides do you give your or statements or what have you do you give your students so they are learning about how to use AI critically but not becoming over reliant on it? I guess how do you what I'm saying is, how do you model that for your students, or how do you like what objectives do you give them, and maybe instructions of, you know, use AI for this but don't use it too much, or this is what you should think about when you're using it so you're not becoming over reliant on it or misusing it.
Is that a question for me or for everyone?
That was a question for everybody, but you can go first if you want to.
Yeah, sure. One of my favorite tools that I use is an AI scale. It was developed by Leon Furt. Some people may know about it. I've written about it. I've kind of adopted it. So one of the things that Leon developed was giving a scale for students, right? So 1 means no AI ideally, and 5 is full on AI, right? That really you're creating everything from beginning to end AI with your own prompting and instructions. And I use that as a student-facing tool. So if I give my students an essay or an assignment or project, whatever it is, I give them those numbers and I back them up. So for example, if a student is doing a free write, right? So just getting their ideas on paper and just kind of working through things, that should be really done without this technology. But for other things, it's more often like a 2 or 3 or 4. And so I try to give them this number and I don't really enforce it, but it's meant to give them a sense of differentiation. I think that one of the pitfalls of this technology is thinking that we have to use it for anything or we have to use it for nothing. And more often than not, if we're really using this technology with purpose, we're being very, very selective about where it's worked into our workflows. And there's no single way to do it. I might like to do a first draft of something myself. Someone else might like to offload that to an AI. Neither approach is necessarily wrong. They're just different. So I try to be very, very clear with my students about and open too, about where AI can help, where can start to take away from their voice, and also let them make their own decisions about that. Because in the end, it's all about student empowerment and giving them the ability to see how they can use AI without losing a portion of themselves.
I can jump in. So one thing that we were grappling with at University of Michigan was around transparency and like, should students be required to document if and when they use AI? Can we hold them accountable? Like, is there any way to check that? And so a lot of instructors put that into their syllabi, right? It's like, you can use AI, but you have to like denote, right, an asterisk of when you used it. Well, then the question comes, well, how do we take that into account when we're assessing that assignment? Like if Reed uses AI and Laura doesn't, like how does that actually impact? And so as educational developers, we're like, that's a great question. And my response to that is, it's not enough to just say you can use it or don't. We have to use this as a metacognitive exercise, right? There needs to be some kind of a reflection as to, for example, you used it in your paper. Tell me when you used it, why you used it, what did you learn, how did it help your learning, what do you think would have happened if you didn't use it, how will this inform your future use, right? Like there are lots of questions that you can ask them, which yes, is more work for the students who are using AI, but that's the trade-off. And not only is it good for their own reflection and building metacognition of how they learn, but it also gives us instructors and developers important information about what's going on in students' head. And we can use that data to recognize patterns and to inform our own teaching. So I think that is a key piece to this is, right, best practice is not just use the tool or don't, but think about what are the benefits of the tool, how did it work in actual practice? If I could give another example as well, I know for instructors, a lot of us are curious about how do we use it to create assignments, right? Create assignment prompts. And so I work a lot in the health sciences, and one area that faculty are experimenting with is, right, how do you interview patients? And getting real patients into your didactic classroom is kind of complicated, and there are ethical issues around that. So sometimes they use simulated patients or actors. And now the question is, can we use GPT software, right, a technology to basically create patients? And what I found is that instructors are like, oh, this is so great, act as a patient this age and this condition and then have a conversation. Well, the piece that's missing is the reflection. Now let's step back and say, how did that conversation go? What are some things that AI said that really, so it's that conversation, that cognitive, that wrapper piece at the end that really is what can take AI use to the next level. So it just always goes back to best practices in teaching and learning, regardless of the technology. So, yes, 2 examples there of what it looks like in practice.
Okay, that's awesome.
Yeah, I put the link to my website in the chat, and I can put it in there again, but I have assignment sheets up in my Creative Commons section that are available to people to look at. And that reflective piece, Dr. Daniels, that's huge, right? As far as transformative learning goes, which we're really big on at University of Central Oklahoma, they have reflection pieces at the end of every single one of their assignments with me. And some of those questions do now involve AI use. And, how did they use it? Why did they use it? I also have them color all of their AI generated text in their assignments in red, which I know there's accessibility issues, but so far that has worked. And then they talk about it in their conferences with me. And we go over, well, why did you use it here? Because if you've heard me talk, if they've got, 2 full paragraphs of AI generated text, why? If they've just got 1 or 2 sentences, then, we can talk about it. And I also ask my students not to use things like Grammarly because of that loss of voice. And I gave a whole talk on voice on Monday and how it's so important for us to privilege or to allow students to privilege their own voices. I don't necessarily, if it's my voice, I don't necessarily want to use my voice when I'm writing a report to my provost, but if I'm writing a chapter that I want other people to read, my voice is going to come through there. So I also show my students, if I have Claude write an outline for me, here's an outline that it wrote, here's the 10-page paper that I wrote off of it. If I want to lecture off of Claude in class or ChatGPT, I will literally pull it up, ask it a question in class, and then we'll go through what it said. And I'll say, okay, this is good, this is bad, this doesn't quite fit. And so we actually just go through it together. And I think that's one of the best things as we model that ethical use and help our students to understand ethical use. And also one other thing, I always relate AI use to being very similar to sex ed. I don't want my kids getting sex ed off of TikTok. I don't want my students getting AI information off of TikTok either. I want them to come and talk to me and talk to each other and learn good ways of using those things.
Okay, yeah. Jason?
Oh, and I also want to say that in so many of these comments, the key in the background is trust. the key in the background is building trust with students. If that's not built, this doesn't work. And one of the things that I love about all these answers is that no one's really talked about detection. No one's really talked about hunting students down. It's been about building trust with students and having them be transparent. And sometimes that means us as instructors or whatever our role is, being transparent about how we're using these tools, having open conversations, building trust, and being honest with the fact that no one knows exactly the correct way to do it. We are figuring these out as we go along. We're trying to create these relationships, these policies that make sense, and we're figuring them out as we go along by talking to each other and being compassionate to each other. So I just want to chime in and say that without trust, this doesn't really work. And so much of it is about establishing that and maintaining that as you go forward.
Okay.
Yeah, I saw somebody say, what if AI answers the questions on the reflection? In my class, they're not going to. Like, we literally create all of these relationships together, and it's just this constant space of relationship building, because that's how you bring students on this journey of learning. And I show them where I've messed up, and I show them where things haven't quite worked the way I want them to, all those kinds of things. So as we build those relationships, like Jason said, as long as there's trust, and the trust goes both ways. They know I'm not going to use AI to assess their work, so they're not going to use AI to write it. They've also said if they knew that a teacher was using AI to assess their work, then they have no reason to write it themselves. They might as well just have AI write it for them, because there's no point then. So yes, everything becomes about that trust, that relationship building, and that understanding of why we're using AI.
Well, and that kind of speaks to, again, you have to model it for your students. And so they're trusting you and you're trusting, it's kind of you have to demonstrate best practices and then show them what to do, and then they'll probably follow that. In my courses and in my work, when I'm making trainings for faculty and staff, I use something called the TCOP model, which is TCOP, which is the technology consumer or producer model. And essentially that means that the teacher or the instructor consumes a lot of best practices made materials or best practice uses of any technology, and then they produce that. They follow that model and they produce it for their students, and they've learned about it. They learned the nature of the tool. They pass that knowledge on to their students, and then the student goes out and consumes other materials or uses of that technology, and then they produce it according to what they've learned. And so eventually you're going to get this chain of people who are teaching and learning and interacting with each other based on the best practices that they have learned. And as a student of a course that was expertly taught with AI and I had excellent models about that, I'm going to ask Dr. Wiley to talk about his experiences using AI in the class and how that affected your course and the students, like their educational process. I am not speaking clearly. Hopefully you can know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing I'll say is, and Reed knows this because we've had class together, I'm a huge proponent of evidence-based practices on the teaching side and on the studying and learning side. But as at least my undergraduate work is in music, but my graduate work was in educational technology, instructional design, designing effective learning experiences. And those evidence-based practices play out in different ways when you use technologies that have different affordances, right? In the classroom, it plays out one way. Online, those practices might play out another. And so even though we do have this long history of evidence-based practices and how that works, and we have a body of best practices built up around existing technologies, like best practices in the classroom versus best practices when you're fully asynchronous online, it's a little different. I think it's kind of early to talk about best practices using generative AI. I think we're all still experimenting. We're all still learning. I don't think there's enough of a record for us to be able to say the best practice when you use generative AI is this or that. And so I've tried to be pretty upfront in the classes that I've taught with generative AI that we're all experimenting, we're all learning. Hopefully this is going to work pretty well. Some of it's going to blow up at some point, and we'll all kind of deal with that together when it happens. But I think the experience Reed is talking about is a course I taught in the spring. I was using generative AI to flip the classroom by basically what I was doing was there were reading assignments and videos to watch and the kind of content that you'd normally do in a flipped classroom before you come to class. But the last thing you did before you came to class was I had written prompts for the students that they would copy and paste into the model of their choice that would kick off a kind of interactive review of the important concepts that were covered in the readings and in the videos. And they do that interactive review, that have the opportunity to ask follow-up questions or get more information, or just however that conversation on those topics played out. And then the last thing they had to do Thursday night, this is a class that met on Fridays, Thursday night they had to upload the transcript of their conversation with the model where they did the review and asked the follow-up questions. And so I could go through and kind of scan those and see what people had understood, what they're struggling with, what it felt like they were interested in because they asked more questions on these tangents. So when we showed up to class on Friday, not only did I know that folks had kind of done the reading, but I could see the reviews that they'd done, what people had been confused about initially, what they were more interested in, and then we could kind of steer what happened in class based on those the data from those conversations that they had had. And it turned out to be, I thought it was a really useful way, a really useful tool for flipping the classroom so we could do more active learning while we were together, because everybody was better prepared by doing that activity.
I know that I was, and again, it fosters that critical thinking of also, you have to do the readings in order to get through the exercise, and you have to actually think about things in order to do the exercise. And it will tell you, especially ChatGPT would tell you, you obviously don't understand, obviously in kinder language, you don't understand what you're talking about. Go back and read it again, or think of it this a different way. So you were learning on the one hand the technology, and on the other hand the subject matter. We have a question in the questions about kind of using AI in different kinds of use cases and in different types of education. And so, Dr. Daniels, in your experience as an instructional designer, because it seems like you have a wide variety of instructional design experience for different audiences and stuff. How do you adapt your recommendations for generative AI, or really for any other technology, based on the audience and based on kind of, I guess, the grade or the age or things like that?
Well, as Dr. Wiley was speaking, there's like a flashing neon light in my head that I was like, oh yeah, I used to say this all the time, which is learning is about the process, not the product, right? Learning is a journey. It's not about the destination, however you want to put it. And I think for a lot of us, when it comes to instructors, when it comes to assignments, we're always thinking about that last step. And things like scaffolding or having conversations or flipping classrooms, for some of us, it feels like natural. That's the way that we always have taught. But for most of us, that is still not the way that we teach normally. And so for me, as I think about ways that you can leverage any kind of technology, it's always about how are you enhancing the writing process. So, or enhancing the creative process, whatever that looks like. So I always want to think about like what are ways that you can build AI in iteratively and get constant feedback, and teaching students the skills of how to do that so that when they're in classrooms or in situations where they don't have an instructor who's as well versed or knowledgeable at AI, they now have the tools, the knowledge, the skills, and the values to do it effectively. Another aspect of this, I think, is how do you use AI to like customize learning? And I think there are some students who genuinely are afraid, like you said, of like losing their voice or becoming too reliant on it. And, I'm paying all this money for college. I don't want to just give me the answers. Well, can we teach them how to use generative AI as a personal tutor, or as like to do like fake interviews, or to do some research and some idea generation that they can then go through and critically analyze and dissect. And so the thing that it boils down to for me is like, what are those discrete skills, right? What are the discrete skills around AI use that we need to be promoting and discovering and building, regardless of discipline, regardless of educational level. And what I think that we're going to start seeing, I know there are a few folks on the call today who are representing the K-12, right? I will say that this is probably going to be more and more normal for, right, certainly high schoolers, middle schoolers, elementary school students. I have a 3-year-old, and he knows how to use Google, right, the Google Home. And so I think, right, the earlier that we can start teaching these skills, and most importantly, the values alongside of it, that will transcend whatever kind of disciplinary or age range that you're in.
Okay, that's really good. I mean, it is kind of just general technology literacy, like you say, like not only can general AI literacy skills be taught, and not only can do the practices around technology literacy, they can be applied to all or many technologies, but different. I mean, even though you're teaching them in different depths to different ages, the earlier they can get experience, and good experience, the better, because then they will learn about that as they grow older and as they get into different domains. And so that's a really good point, that it's really about the general skills rather than, you know, applying those skills specifically to different topics or different fields and things. I know I'm making some tutorials and some videos currently for actually like 3 different projects, and it struck me like if I could just make a general tutorial for anything, because it's really about those general skills. Like, you need to think through the context, you need to think through the audience, you need to think through your objectives. And as long as you know how to think about those things and analyze those, you can do all sorts of stuff with all sorts of tools, as long as you know the general things you need to think about and how to put that in a prompt, or how to select, you know, the different buttons or the different aspects that you need to do. So, Jason, do you have any more thoughts about that?
Yeah, and this will be
Thoughts in
sort of
general?
echoing what a lot of people have said, because I think that especially ever since ChatGPT came out and then every other program came out, there's such this language of disruption, that it was all about rethinking everything from the ground up. And I think one of the big takeaways for me, from what I've read, what I've experimented with, and also just from this conversation, is that a lot of it is going to be leaning into those core skills, right? And like, so some of the things that we're thinking about, right? Critical thinking, right? Close reading and close analysis. These are not new at all. I think one of the things that is helpful and that gives me hope with this technology is that it's getting to a point that we need to really, really return to these. And we can look back at things we might have been teaching for 10 years or more and think about, are we actually assessing those core skills? So for my discipline, so from writing, a lot of us have just been teaching essays, right? And a lot of us, we might not even have a process that we looked at. We just have students write an essay, hand it in, and that is it. And so one of the things that AI I think is forcing a lot of us to do is to go back to that and say, well, is that the best way to assess critical thinking? Is that the best way to assess close reading or whatever skill we're looking for? Or are there ways that I can switch it up? Because I personally think that despite all these ideas that reading and writing are going to die, I actually think that being able to read and write closely and carefully is going to become more and more pivotal going forward. If you don't know how to close read, you have a lot of difficulty with AI. Right? You have difficulty dialoguing with it and figuring out what's going on there. And so I think it's going to be a matter of going back to those core skills and figuring out how we can really assess them, focus on them, and get students to develop those rather than feeling like we need to throw everything away. I think that despite the language of disruption, it's going to be about focusing on those skills and being honest with ourselves about whether we've been focusing on those or if there is a better way to do it.
If I can add to that, I've never been a traditional writing teacher. I'm a tech writer who started teaching comp also. And so I brought my tech writing skills into the comp classroom, number one. And then number two, my husband did his thesis on power relationships and Paulo Freire, especially in the classroom. And so I have always been one to kind of disrupt the classroom, if you will. And we spend so much time talking. And so we read and then we talk and then we also write. But you can't learn how to be a good writer if you're not learning how to read other people's work. because that's where we understand how language works and how it makes meaning. And we start to understand what rhetorical analysis means when we look and go, oh, why did they use this word over this word? And so, yeah, we can bring all of that back to what AI can and can't do. And that's one of the reasons, again, that I don't like Grammarly and that Word and I fight a lot when we're editing, because it comes down and it's like, I don't like it when you say huge, you need to say gigantic. I don't like it when you say very bad, you should say really bad, right? And I'm like, no, that's like, it's the same thing. You just don't like how I phrased it. So as we talk about what good writing is, we always come back to who our audience is. And, you know, I've also been doing SOTL projects, Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, for like 7 years now. And I was the SOTL mentor on campus for a while. And so when AI hit, I was just like, okay, well, let's see what happens here. Let's try this out and play with it. And so my thing with AI is, as a teacher, you've got to be playing with these tools and encouraging your students to play with them. So it's not like, I'm going to catch you for cheating. It's like, no, let's play around with this and see what happens. Let's try it out and see what happens. This did a really bad job here. But all of those kinds of things, if we're going to teach students how to use the AI well, it just comes back to sometimes we use AI, and then like Jason said, sometimes we do close reading of things. And I'm really trying to think about the idea of maybe bringing back in 1 day a month of just, you bring in whatever you want to do and you read for half an hour, 45 minutes, and then we go around and get in small groups and you talk to other people about what you read. Does that have anything to do with writing? Everything to do with it. Because also, if we're interested in what we're reading, we can talk about it better. And so I let students, you know, try and find things that interest them to write about. I'm not having everybody write the same position paper. One of the ways that I'm using ChatGPT in the fall, so ChatGPT 4.0 allows you to go into your space and visually like use the space. So they already have to do a paper about a place and how accessible it is, and they can decide what sort of difference in ability they're talking about. But now they can use GPT 4.0 to actually visually see the space as well. And so they can get ideas from GPT 4.0, you know, about how the space might be more or less accessible. And so we can play again with that technology and bring it into our classrooms without necessarily disrupting everything. It's just a different way of coming to the learning.
Well, we learn by doing, right?
Yeah.
You learn by doing, and the only way to learn about these tools is to play with them.
That's
Oh,
go ahead.
sorry. No, I'm sorry. I was gonna I was just gonna add like maybe just like a little bit of reality to what we're talking about as well. I often have to remind myself that like experimentation and play can be a privilege, and a privilege that not a lot of instructors have access to. We did not calculate the timing of the onset of Gen AI. And there are a lot of really messed up things happening in the world at the same time. Institutional racism is still a thing. And I just feel like when I have conversations with folks around generative AI, it still evokes a lot of reactions and a lot of like emotional reactions. Some of them are very positive and excitement and curiosity, which I think is, you know, amplified in the panel today. But also there are a lot of folks who are really terrified by it, and they're afraid of job security. They're like lack of confidence. They're frustrated that here's another skill set that they have to learn in the midst of dealing with mental health crises on campus. And so I just want to like honor the fact that like not everybody, like it's easy to say, oh, just play an experiment. I know I say that too. But also it is a privilege to be able to do those things amongst all of the other things that we have to do as instructors and all the other ways that we need to care for ourselves and for others. That being said, I feel like it's ethical responsibility for me to try to lower the barrier to entry to learning about Gen AI. And so I have a lot of conversations with administrators of like, how do we make time and space and instructor schedules to be able to learn these things? How do we honor like the resistance that they feel towards it, instead of just saying, oh no, you're just being a curmudgeon or you're just behind, but actually like talking through those fears and apprehensions. And I don't know, I'd be curious to hear from folks on the panel, but like that first entry point, like getting an instructor to actually log into UMGPT or ChatGPT and type something in, that is a huge barrier, like cognitively, oh, I don't have time, I don't know what to ask it, oh, I'm not impressed. And so I think for us collectively, those of us who have beaten some of those barriers, like we need to think collectively of like, how do we support folks? So Reed, I'm so excited to hear about some of these videos that you're developing. But sometimes it's even hard for someone to click on a video, right? We just feel like we don't have time. So I'm just really appreciative of all the people who are on the call today. And I just want to honor, if you're still, even after attending several webinars, still feeling shy or apprehensive, like those feelings make complete sense to me. And I think we need to address those larger societal issues before we can just have fun and experiment and be carefree about it.
And I do, so going along with that, I do offer workshops both at my university and at other universities to help faculty just take some time to think through just one assignment. Like, how would you upgrade one assignment? What sorts of literacy activities would you put in for AI for one class? Because you're right, people don't have time, especially if we're thinking about adjunct instructors or contract instructors, or if we're thinking about people who have really large classes and they're just trying to survive, a 4-4 teaching load with 200 science students in every class, right? And you're right, it is a super privilege to have that space. And so I do try and offer workshops as often as people will have me to do them so that we can take that time and play together. And somebody in the comments said that they're offering a play space at their institution soon. And I've seen that happen in Oklahoma a few times as well. So I think, as much as faculty administrators can bring in people like myself and Jason and other people who are both talking and then showing how to do it. It's like, if Jason were to run a professional development on chatbots, I would show up. I don't necessarily know how I'm going to use chatbots yet, but I would show up because I want to see what Jason's doing with them and I want to have that conversation more deeply. But you're right, it really is. And especially if we're looking at smaller institutions, community colleges, places that don't have a lot of money to bring people in, and K-12, if you're trying to train up people and you only have them while they're on contract, it also becomes very hard to find space to teach people.
Read it, Steve. What a great job you've all done. We do need to finish up so people have a chance to go to the next set of sessions. Can we give a big thanks to everybody who's been on the panel? And Reed, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
No,
we do
you're
have to shift gears. Did you want to say anything as a final say?
No, I just wanted to say that, again, this has been a really good opportunity. I really appreciate all of you for coming and sharing all your perspectives. I just wanted to mention that I personally, and I know that I think everybody on this panel is dedicated to the open and the affordable and equitable access to AI. And so hopefully through these sessions, we'll all be able to learn about how we can use AI without having to, go through subscriptions or go through expensive and detailed training sessions, but able to use these in an equitable way and train our students in a way that they won't feel overwhelmed by it. So thank you again for this panel. This has been fantastic. And yes, the session information for the future sessions will be on teaching and learning.ai. Steve, do you want to share more information about that?
Yes, for obvious reasons, given that I haven't had a chat spam like that in years. But the reason we don't publish the links publicly and require people to register is to avoid that. So if you go to the front page of Teaching and Learning with AI, of learningrevolution.com, you can find the links to the next upcoming sessions. Hopefully we won't see any more of that, but thank you so much. And please go to support those presenters who have gotten in their rooms and gotten all prepared.
Thank you, Reed, for great facilitation. Thanks, everybody.
No, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Good to see everyone.
So should we hang out at all, or are we just going
I
off
would-
on
I
our
have a
merry way?
question. I have
Don't
questions
you
for you,
dare.
Jason.
I'm gonna have to close the rooms to kick people out so they'll go to the other sessions. But you guys did a great job, and